the filming of Waterloo took place in what is now the Ukraine. In those days it was Russia. And in 1969 in Russia it was quite hard to get these amount of people together in rather reduced circumstances in terms of accommodation and so on. But we had between 10 and 15,000 soldiers with us every day for months, and this was the Russian army. The landscape had been remodeled to represent the field of Waterloo. It had taken years. There were thousands of guns cast, thousands of uniforms made by the Italians, and it was a truly international film. Long before the era of CGI, so everything you see in that film is real. And we spent months making a film, only a few scenes of which really now exist. It had to be chopped down in the end to a couple of hours or whatever it is now. But the original film was very long. And in those days, the Soviets used to watch very long films day by day, so they were used to that. I don't know what happened to all the outtakes, but I spent many, many months on horseback. And none of that is seen, but enough is left to give you a flavour. The conditions were fairly primitive. We were all cooped up, all these film stars, super film stars, and me, a very young new actor, in a concrete hotel in a place called Uzhgorod, which I'm told in Russian means Snake City. And it was primitive. The Italians cheered us up by refusing to work unless they could have pasta, so it all had to be specially imported from Italy. And when breakfast cereal, that was the other great thing. Food was in pretty short supply apart from that, but there was plenty to drink. Slightly different drink than we were accustomed to, but plenty of it. There was Russian champagne, which is barely corked, very fizzy, very sweet, and beer. And the beer was so fresh that most of it didn't even have a cap on the bottle. It was refreshing though, and after all day in the saddle, because we actually lived very much as the people of those days did. You got up in the morning, put your uniform on, were driven a very short distance to this vast camp, got on in the saddle, and that was it for the day. And so after weeks and weeks of that, one really began to get the flavour of being a Napoleonic era soldier out there in the sun. Okay, now there's one, I mentioned before that there were some tricky moments, and I'd like to echo the dangers of Mercer with the dangers of copying him. And from my point of view, the great element in the film was the charge, the mass charge of the French cavalry. Now, of course, when you film this, you film it in two complete halves. The first bit of filming was done looking at me, with nothing to look at all, raising my sword and shouting fire, and then cutting away on another shot to have all the guns blazing. This would then be intercut with shots of the Great Charge. The Great Charge, of course, was done weeks and weeks and weeks later, and was a spectacular piece of filming. We needed endless cameras, and there were a great many horses. I think there were 1,100 cavalry. Anyway, it felt like the ground was shaking. And you slowly saw the build-up as more and more forces were brought together into this huge charge. What they'd asked me to do, because by then, obviously, I'd finished doing my side of it, was the cameraman for the press side said, look, I've got a spare camera, and I'd like you to hunker down by one of the guns, and if you can, take some shots of the cavalry as they approach, because I need lots of publicity shots, so you might be able to get some good ones from down there. So there we are. I had this camera, and it had a motor drive on it, which was rather exciting. So there I was, and off they went, and the thunder of hooves approached. It was really quite an extraordinary sight. They really do look quite amazing. Horses everywhere. And then a rather odd thing happened, because there was supposed to be a tailing off. The charge was supposed to peter out before it got to the guns, and then that would be the end of the shot, and then they'd cut it all together. Unfortunately, what happened was that the wind shifted a bit, and halfway through the charge, the dust of all these horses and charging cavalrymen enveloped the charge and blew along in front of it. So they couldn't actually see where they were going, and they overrode where they were supposed to go, straight through the guns where I was crouched. Luckily, I had the presence of mind to drop the camera and grab an axle of a gun, was knocked back with it about 50 yards, suffering nothing worse than a bit of bruising and a lot of choking dust. But it was, as Wellington said, a pretty near run thing. My name is Richard Heffer, and in 1969, a long time ago now, I was playing Mercer in a film of the Battle of Waterloo. And it's a role that's always stuck by me as being a particularly interesting one to do, inasmuch as we both very nearly lost our lives doing it. In due course, I got in touch with Robert, and he had the great sense to propose that we explored the battlefield. Now, I had been to the battlefield briefly once. What I wanted to do was to see it from the point of view of a historical, knowledgeable perspective. So we ended up doing a most marvellous special tour, following in the footsteps of this man as he left England and trundled his guns across Belgium to the battlefield. And it was an absolutely marvellous occasion. Robert was a very interesting, jolly man, and made a great trip out of this exploration. So I can't recommend his efforts too highly to anyone. I can certainly say that if you go with campaigns and culture, you'll get campaign and you'll get culture, but you'll also have a heck of a good time.